My name is Roudabeh Kishi. I'm Director of Research and Innovation at ACLED. So thanks so much for joining us for this panel today with a number of my colleagues. I'll be beginning today with sharing a bit of background first on ACLED, especially on our sourcing and information collection that we do, before handing things over to some of my colleagues who are joining us from Cabo, Ligado, the Yemen Data Project, MilitiaWatch, and Afghan Peace Watch. We'll do the same while speaking to the various challenges that each of them are facing in their data collection work. If I can figure out how to, okay, I think it's happening. At ACLED, we're the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project. We collect data on political violence and demonstrations around the world in near real time. We're an independent NGO. We started as an academic project once upon a time, meaning that we come from a background of rigorous and robust methodology, but now we are a standalone entity. We've always been a fully remote organization, even before COVID, with no brick and mortar office, especially as we found that it's helped us to really benefit from being able to build a team of researchers that are based around the world with local language and context knowledge. So new data are updated weekly, published on Mondays and Tuesdays based on the region, and are freely accessible by the public. Anyone can register for a free account and can access the data through our data export tool, an API call, and which you can access via our website, which is on the URL on the screen. In addition to the data we make available weekly, we also have research and analysis that are accessible as well. These include weekly regional overviews that offer a quick snapshot of the latest ongoings in each region, in-depth reports that include reflective pieces as well as quick snapshots, actor profiles, infographics, and more, including special projects and initiatives like our new early warning research hub, which I'll be discussing in a pitch session at the conference tomorrow for those who want to join that. So ACLED is an event-based data set. Information is quite granular. We code by the specific day, the specific location, including geocoordinates for mapping and spatial analysis, and the specific engagement, which in turn means that information can be really flexible to accommodate a wide range of levels of analysis, from local dynamics to the country year level. We offer a wide range of disorder with broad event types, including various forms of violence, demonstrations, and strategic developments, as well as more granular sub-event types. We also include information on a wide variety of groups and actors, as well as fatality estimates. Our coverage currently covers the majority of the globe, following our recent expansions to the rest of Europe and the US. Later this year, we're planning to release coverage of small island states to supplement the regions that we already cover, and are planning to begin work on Canada and Oceania, especially as with those expansions, ACLED will become fully available. So I often people ask why different data projects, especially global ones, might different trends in the same context. If both purport to report on the same thing, like political violence, then why might one data set say violence is increasing while another says it's decreasing? Or why might the geography of violence look two different ways when looking through two different lenses? And so while a number of things can of course feed into those types of distinctions, like the unit of analysis, typology, definitions, catchment, etc. We have found that sourcing specifically is the most important, where different projects get their information from, unsurprisingly, drastically impacts how different data projects will in turn depict a context. And that question is then usually followed by a question of whether a higher number of sources is better, or what sources of information are maybe the best. And we've found that the number of sources doesn't really guarantee that data are necessarily more reliable, quote unquote. All sources contain some biases, they have specific focuses, and so the mere inclusion of more sources just for the sake of more will just simply reproduce those biases just on a larger scale without necessarily impacting reliability. So for example, an international media outlet based in the US might report only certain types of events abroad, like those that are high in casualties that their readership wants to read about, or events that happen in certain areas like those that their foreign correspondents can easily access. And so adding 4 more sources that look quite similar in scope to that initial source would really do little to broaden the coverage. The new sources will probably just end up reporting those same events. And so the reliability of coverage isn't therefore necessarily bettered, quote unquote, by simply upping the number of sources. And rather, what we have found at ACLED to be the most important is to remember that countries are unique in both their conflict and in their media landscapes. So this means one size does not fit all when it comes to developing a sourcing strategy. So rather, each context requires its own unique sourcing profile that takes into account the distinct nuances of each of those specific landscapes. And so it's in that vein that we found that what does indeed seem to make sourcing more reliable has consistently been prioritizing local sources, relying on local media, especially in local non-English languages, in relationships with those who have a local knowledge and expertise. So of course, curating so many distinct profiles, each accounting for nuances in the conflict and media landscape and a multitude of different contexts, presents its own unique challenges to data collection. It would be, frankly, a lot easier to just scrape a set list of English language news sources and be done with it. But we found that doing that misses so much of the dynamics that are happening on the ground, which is why we've tried to take a different approach at ACLED in an effort to get closer to capturing those really local dynamics. At ACLED, we've drawn information from thousands of media sources. As I mentioned, we prioritize local media, so like national newspapers or local radio, and in local languages. ACLED researchers with local language knowledge allow us to cover media in over 75 different languages. While we don't crowdsource, we do increasingly use specific or trusted new media sources, like the vetted Twitter account of a journalist, for example, or trusted Telegram channels. And we found that that's really especially useful in some spaces where the media environment can be quite closed. We draw on in-depth reporting that comes from international organizations like Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, the UN, especially as those types of reports can really offer more granular information from hard to access spaces. And then lastly, but really importantly, we benefit from partnerships, conflict observatories and organizations. And that can be especially crucial in accessing unique information. And so we have a number of such partnerships, I think over 50 and counting around the world, including the few examples that I've included on the slide, representatives from whom are joining me on this panel. We have Tomás Queface on the panel from Cabo Ligado, or Connected Cape, which is a conflict observatory that monitors political violence in Mozambique and provides cutting-edge analysis of the latest conflict trends. Information collection for the observatory is based on a number of online sources, as well as correspondence based on the ground in Cabo Delgado, with gathered information being cross-checked with other sources. So with the growing insurgency in Cabo Delgado and the lack of information coming out about it, we at ACLED had a real gap in our coverage of the region, which is why we established Cabo Delgado in partnership with local media groups, Zitamar News and Media Facts, to help us gather better information about what's happening, which we're able to in turn code and include in our data coverage now at ACLED. And then the data are then used in turn to feed into the regular weekly and monthly analysis pieces on the conflict by Cabo Delgado. Iona Craig is with us on the panel from the Yemen Data Project, which collects data on the conflict in Yemen, relying on open sources for their information gathering, including local Arabic language media and social media postings. In addition to collating incidents of violence, YDP also records civilian casualties in the air war and uses the most conservative figures reported by open sources. And all of their sourcing material is then shared and saved for reference purposes by the Yemeni archive. YDP's extensive coverage of media has really played a significant role in ACLED sourcing of events in the Yemeni war. Our researchers are able to use YDP's archived materials to code events that fall within our catchment and in turn into ACLED data. The difficulties around access by the international media in the region have often resulted in inaccurate accounts of the conflict. And so working in partnership with YDP has really allowed us to surmount some of these challenges by benefiting from their local knowledge and expertise. Hampton is the founder and editor-in-chief of MilitiaWatch, a research platform that tracks, analyzes, and publishes information on the units, coalitions, and ideologies of US-based far-right militia groups. So the work is based on qualitative and quantitative data derived from open source intelligence workflows, supplemented by research into semi-public forums and through other contacts. When we expanded our coverage at ACLED to the US last year, we did so in the aftermath of Floyd's killing and the spike in Black Lives Matter demonstrations, as well as the lead up to the November presidential election. And a prominent trend that we found was the role of far-right militia groups. And while these groups are beginning to be covered more and more in the media, especially in light of events like the January 6th storming of the Capitol, there was a real lack of reporting by the media around when these groups, especially the smaller groups without big names like the Proud Boys, might be present at protests, when groups might be engaging in recruitment, where training exercises by these groups might be taking place, all of which are really useful strategic developments to monitor when tracking trends in disorder more largely across the US. And MilitiaWatch's unique tracking of this information has really helped us at ACLED to fill in this gap and to better understand the role of the far right in the American context. And lastly, Habib Khan, the founder of Afghan Peace Watch, is joining us. APW is Afghanistan's independent peace watchdog, an apolitical and nonprofit umbrella organization for research, digital media publications, and peace advocacy. They've been documenting all war-related incidents since early 2020 via a vast network of reporters in 34 Afghan provinces, with broad reach throughout Afghanistan on the district level. In addition to monitoring all war-related violence, they also publish reports and in-depth analysis on peace and security. At ACLED, our coverage of the Afghan war had previously relied really heavily on information and reporting from the warring parties themselves, the Afghan Ministry of Defense and the Voice of Jihad, which is published by the Taliban. Especially as the conflict landscape, as well as the physical geographic landscape, had made it really difficult for traditional media outlets to report incidents from across the country. And these sources would often provide information on the smaller or more remote skirmishes. However, a recent strategic shift to less reporting by these parties in line with the peace negotiations pushed us to expand our coverage in order to ensure that we were still capturing all war-related violence across the country. And APW's reporting, based on a grassroots network of reporters based across the country, has really helped us to supplement our coverage greatly, ensuring that we capture information that's not previously reported by others. And so we are really looking forward at ACLED to publishing those data in the coming weeks. So I'd like to hand things over now to the other panelists. Each will discuss the work at their organization in a bit more detail, shedding light specifically on their data collection and the challenges that they face. My hope is that we will then leave a bit of time at the end to open up the floor to any questions the audience may have about the work of any of our organizations in particular, or about data collection strategies more largely. And so without further ado, I'll hand things off to Tomás to start us off by discussing the work and data collection that he helps to organize at Cabo Ligado.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this meeting. My name is Tomás Queface, and I've been leading a project in the Cabo Ligado project. Cabo Ligado project, as you said earlier, is a project that has been monitoring the conflict in Mozambique. So I've been leading Community Reporters Network. Just to give a bit of context on the conflict in Cabo Delgado, which is located in northern Mozambique, has been taking place since 2017, when armed groups, mostly referred as insurgents, but also known as locally held Al-Sunna, Wajama, or Al-Shabaab, but with no affiliation with the Somali group. In 2017, they attacked the police station in a district in Cabo Delgado called Mocimbo da Praia. The armed group has since carried out many attacks, killing innocent civilians, destroying and burning houses. The conflict has killed more than 2,800 people and displaced more than 800,000 people. So both the insurgents and state security forces that have been fighting the insurgents have been implicated in human rights abuses, including intimidation, arbitrary arrests, and ill treatment of. So almost since the outbreak of the conflict, human rights organizations have documented multiple cases in which government forces have barred various media organizations and correspondents from visiting the province of Cabo Delgado, while security forces have detained or arrested journalists who entered the province. For example, there is a journalist called Ibrahim Baruco. He used to work in Cabo Delgado for a community radio. He has been missing for over a year. There is another journalist called Amadi Abubakar as well, Stasio Valoy, a researcher from Amnesty International. All have been detained since 2019 by security forces. So, although in Mozambique, the role of journalists and freedom of expressions are protected under the Constitution and other national and international laws, journalists run great risk for covering the stories on the conflict that is taking in Cabo Delgado. So after the media blockage and the absence of journalists on the ground, it was really difficult to get a sense of what was happening there. So this vacuum opened new opportunities and channels for citizens to become the main source of information that news organizations, research institutions will rely on. But because reporting on the conflict is dangerous, there is always a urge to protect these people, to make them anonymous in order to guarantee their safety. So we at Cabo Delgado created this network of correspondents last year. We provide them with tools and skills to report. One of the things that we did in the beginning was trying to make them anonymous and use secure apps to share news. Because in Mozambique, if police, especially in a conflict area, see you taking a picture, they will arrest you and confiscate your phone. And if there is anything that might compromise the person who took that picture, he will be arrested. And to avoid this kind of situations, we have been using very secure apps to guarantee some kind of safety. And the second thing we do is to provide them with journalistic skills, the basic journalistic skills like writing a very good text message. So what the correspondents in Cabo Delgado provide a description of what's really happening there at the present moment. We train them to be observers. So when they publish any information, when they send us any information, we don't immediately validate that information. So sometimes when multiple sources locally in Cabo Delgado send us the same kind of information, we then approve that message, that we validate that information. It's not 100% reliable, but they are mainly the only source we have on the ground. So the information that is submitted to us by the correspondents on the ground, we then share it with the two main news agents that have been working on the Cabo Delgado project, which are Zitamar News and MediaFax. Both are local-based news agencies. So while we encourage the correspondents, for example, to share rumors that are circulating locally, we always ask them to make a distinction when they send us a message and information of what is a fact, what is an opinion, and what is a rumor. So we give them the ability to categorize each message, information they are submitting to us. Well, there are additional challenges of reporting from Cabo Delgado. The first is that since September 2020, there has been some districts in Cabo Delgado that have been without electricity since then. It is believed that the insurgents have sabotaged the electrical substation that used to provide electricity to the area. The result is that sometimes we receive information of an event that happened many hours or even days before. Sending devices such as portable chargers to those areas, it's quite difficult. The second challenge that we have is that The network coverage is always affected as well by different factors. The first one is electricity, as I mentioned, but both the sergeants as well as security forces sometimes have been sabotaging the network platforms in that area. For example, in the recent attack that took place on the town of Palma, where the LNG project that is run by Total is taking place, just minutes before the attack, citizens reported that there were many people fleeing the area and that something happening. But just minutes after that message was sent, we lost communication with that area for 2 weeks. So for 2 weeks, we lost all kinds of reports, informations about human rights violations in that area. So that is another big challenge that we have been facing. So this correspondent network that we have been leading, Ligado, provide a platform for people in conflict areas to share the stories that affect them, to share the experiences, because although they live in local areas, most of our correspondents are now displaced people. So they have been sharing the experiences on first hand. They've been sharing the views on the situations. And just to finalize, the information that they have been sending, it's important because they both make the governments as well as the insurgents hold accountable for their own actions. Thank you.
Thanks, Tomás. Iona, do you want to speak on YDP next?
Sure. We started at the Yemen Data Project collecting data on the conflict in Yemen right from the beginning. It sort of happened organically, really. But the Yemen Data Project didn't exist in a name or any kind of organization until 18 months into the Saudi intervention in Yemen, because everybody thought the war was going to last 2 weeks, or at least Saudi Arabia did. And so when we started collecting information on the airstrikes, after a year, it was quite apparent that we had a growing data set and information that could be useful to others, that was sitting gathering dust, really. So we passed that data on to the Guardian newspaper at the time. It took them 3 months to go through the raw data set to be able to do any reporting on it. And they then said we had to have a name. So hence the Yemen Data Project was born. And we created a WordPress website literally overnight. An investigative journalist later said to me, the only reason we knew it wasn't set up by one party in the conflict was because it looked like it had been set up by a bunch of students in their bedroom, the website. So because it was so kind of ropey. But we didn't have any funding for the first 3 years. So we were all doing it voluntarily, and we didn't obviously have the funds to be forking out for a flashy website. And it wasn't until several years into the conflict, having collected tens of thousands of incidents, that we then decided, having got some funding, that we would go back through the entire data set and use the same methodology we had done with open sources to then calculate the civilian casualties in the air war in particular. So Yemen Data Project also gathers data on the ground war, if you like, or political violence, and that is passed on to ACLED. But we do the airstrikes data separately ourselves, and within that we now do casualty counting. It took a year to go back through the entire data set and record civilian casualties for every single air raid incident. And as was mentioned in the introduction, all of our sources are open source, and we do use the most conservative numbers reported. For example, if there is reporting of dozens killed in a particular airstrike, we will count that as 12 and not more than 12. Because dozen, of course, would indicate plural of 12, which would be 24, but we will always go with the most conservative number. Similarly, tens, we will record that as 10. unless there is independent reporting from the ground, from either human rights organizations within Yemen, like Moatana, or others that have physically been there. Because, as you can probably tell, I am not Yemeni. I am the only person who's involved in the project, really, because going on to the point about challenges, one of the biggest challenges has been right since the beginning is security concerns for those that are doing the work. They are all in Yemen. This conflict started as a civil war, and elements of it, certainly most are now still a civil war, but it has sort of evolved into a much more complex conflict. But it does mean it is very dangerous for those doing this kind of work when they're stationed in countries. So they remain completely anonymous, all of the team doing the data collection, to the point that, because when I'm not doing Yemen data project stuff, I'm a journalist and I spend a lot of time going in and out of Yemen, and I've had my own issues with parties to the conflict on both sides, and been detained by both sides as well. I don't actually know the real names of those doing the data collection in Yemen, because what information I don't know, I then cannot pass on to authorities, because journalists that have been arrested or detained have also been tortured. And of course, that kind of information could put all of them in danger. So yeah, security is a big concern for us, and always has been. And it's why I kind of do the fronting or the representation of it, even though I am not actually representative, if you like, of those that are doing the real donkey work. And so, yes, there are a kind of team of people behind me that never get seen, and there's a reason for that. Our other challenge, really, and it goes back to what has already been spoken about, and that is on the biases within the sourcing. So our sourcing is nearly all of it from Arabic language, and it's collected by data collectors who are Yemenis. So they're very familiar with the media landscape in Yemen, but we also take sourcing from social media as well. So it's then the time that has to be spent in researching those sources, if you like, particularly if it's new or different social media accounts that aren't familiar, to working out the biases. And wherever possible, we try and have a balance in that sourcing. So if there is a bias of one party to conflict as an open source, we then try and find another one that is, if you like, equally biased on the other side. But that is really hard, and it's an ongoing challenge. The other aspect really is we categorize all of the targets, or what is hit anyway, in the airstrikes, and a large amount from open sources aren't named. So in the sort of growing category is now what we classify as unknown. And although our broad categories are military and non-military, we then break that down into education, into water infrastructure and electricity, and all the sort of obvious, if you like, subcategories. There is a large chunk now, the majority of the air raids, that are classified as unknown. And we have spent some time trying to research further that category of unknown to see if we could actually identify those targets, but it just wasn't possible. And we spent quite a lot of time dedicated to that with some funding that we got, and it wasn't giving us any definitive answers, unfortunately. The other aspects that are sort of challenging as well, I think more broadly on the early warning aspect, which we're all talking about now, is really how useful is this kind of data in early warning. Certainly for civilians on the ground, we're recording stuff that's already happened. So we can't necessarily give warnings to civilians when there are going to be airstrikes, because we're gathering the data after it has happened. Having said that, it could possibly be that this kind of data is useful for warning to the international community. And we do monthly summaries of our data that we release publicly, but we've also, in the last 2 ceasefires, been doing weekly monitoring during ceasefire periods of airstrikes, where they are, casualty counting, of course, anyway, and how much of a de-escalation there is in the conflict during the periods of ceasefires. So that can be helpful, certainly to the international community, but also with trends in the data, you can see and I guess warn of when there is increased violence, or equally when there is a decrease in violence, when that's useful. But as far as early warning goes, yes, this is the kind of data that is picking up information after the event rather than before. And just lastly, really on the challenges, as I'm sure I can probably speak for everybody here, is the funding side of it. You know, we didn't have any funding for the first part of 3 years of doing this data collection. And there's always that angst that, you know, in another 6 months' time, or when your period of funding runs out from your funds you've got at the moment, you won't be able to get more. And of course, with so much going on around the world, particularly related to the pandemic in the last year and a half now, funders' focus has shifted a lot, or is changing, or their priorities are changing. And so there's that constant uncertainty of trying to keep the project running when you don't know necessarily where your funding is going to be coming from by the end of the year. And that is always a challenge when you're running a very kind of niche project like we are in one country, where interest in it can fluctuate massively. And 1 minute people are very enthusiastic about the data or being informed about the conflict, and then not for up to 6 months at a time. But of course, the data still needs to be collected in that period. So yeah, funding is always a challenge for everybody doing this kind of work. But I will pass on now.
Thanks, Iona. Hampton, shall we move to you and some of your work with MilitiaWatch?
Sure, and I'm going to share my screen because I'm a visual nerd. I'm going to try and keep this really quick so that we have some time towards the end. So I'm going to skip over a little bit of the introduction about who I am. Roudabeh did a great job with that, and jump right into the challenges. So I think, you know, my two other colleagues on this call have identified exactly these same challenges where there's so much information. The information environment is really sort of ever changing and nebulous. But I think something that is particularly important for the US-based far right that I track is that everything that is posted on the internet is at the same time permanent and totally ethereal. So if you're not documenting and archiving things, that one example of something that you saw 2 months ago that you need now is no longer there. And this sort of like evolving information, this like really specific media environment, you know, it's very different for every country context. But then when you break that down into sort of specific political sides, or even like armed movements, that media environment gets even more specific to the context. And with the recent deplatforming of a lot of the groups that I track, it means that even the group's own information sourcing is kind of all over the place. So I'm going to go through some of the data sources that I use with MilitiaWatch. The obvious one is this local news reporting. It's oftentimes really vague when they're talking about far-right groups. They'll say things like armed men or men with guns, and it takes a little bit more digging to get into what group is there, what they're actually doing. There's also a really sort of healthy network of activist researchers in the United States who are doing documentation on the far right and putting it online, you know, open source for everybody. Groups themselves often also will post things on their social media, you know, saying that we're doing this event. That's a good hint for who was involved in that event. They'll also post direct photo and video documentation of themselves at said event. So if there's a protest that's reported on, and then you can find that group's social media, it's highly likely that they will have posted some nice selfies or a group shot like this. There's also after action reports for events that groups will post. So this is a good way to confirm that a training that was scheduled months in advance actually happened, where they'll sort of detail what they did. There's also press releases. Some of these groups like have turned their blogs into sort of press release machines where they comment on whatever's going on. And then there's all kinds of other different material like these type of event flyers that circulate on everything from WhatsApp to Telegram to Facebook. So there's always a question of what we can do with all of this information. The problem isn't getting information, it's trying to structure it and figure out what it means. And ACLED does a really good job of refining that physical event data. It's kind of the bread and butter of ACLED overall, and MilitiaWatch plugin is like pretty simple here. You know, it's getting who is involved, where, at what time, and what did they do. But with MilitiaWatch, I also focus on other things such as the unit structure. This is something that was kind of essential to the foundation of MilitiaWatch as a research platform, which was to understand how militia units were organizing themselves, how they were building coalitions, how those coalitions or militia groups themselves were breaking down. But then also increasingly, I'm trying to take a more anthropological approach to look at sort of the specific cultural and you know, even political or social contexts out of which these groups arise. So like, how are they replicating themselves? How are they restructuring themselves? How are they adapting to a changing environment? There's also other kinds of data, like you could take this picture and identify every weapon that people are carrying and you know, get an average price point for how much they spent on their sort of game day outfit here. The second challenge that I think is important for looking at a lot of these armed groups is the contextualization problem. A lot of these groups will very deliberately inflate how large they are, how powerful they are, you know, where they are spatially. They'll often sort of seek to use journalists to make claims about what the group stands for, saying things that like they are protecting everybody's constitutional rights, when in fact they, in private chats, are like highly Islamophobic and have a history of threatening protesters. I think there's also a misconception about these groups in two ways about their network linkages. On one hand, there's an assumption that a lot of these groups are highly distinct, when there's actually a lot of individual and group overlap. But on the other hand, these groups are highly competitive with one another, and there are really big walls that they put up between each other that oftentimes aren't super obvious. And they are, of course, acting within a really complex web of different incentives and forces that we often aren't really able to get at. So we just kind of have to assume that there's like a huge X factor behind the human behavior side of this. So just an example of this projecting force. This is the claimed counties of the New Mexico Civil Guard, which was a militia group that was involved in a shooting event. They weren't the ones who did the shooting, but they were sort of there. This was where they claimed to have county militias for the group. And then this chart over here on the right, the black overlay is where they actually had a set up Facebook page for each of the counties. And then these numbers here are specifically the engagement that the Facebook pages have. So a lot of these were, you know, 3 posts, 2 posts, 1 like, 4 likes, very small, not a whole lot of engagement. Whereas other ones like the Curry County one, which was where almost everybody who was involved in the protests that led to the shooting had 11 posts and 295 likes. So that was almost 300 people following the page. So a bit more influential. Just a quick note on the networks. I'm a big kind of freak for network analysis. I come from like a social network analysis like background. It's kind of what I'm really interested in. And this is just a quick visualization of a network of channels and the administration teams, the moderation teams for walkie-talkie like chat rooms that militia groups were involved in. The reddish purplish tint here is those that are directly associated with the 3% movement, which is a particular brand of national US militia. I think this is one that all of us are very oriented towards, which is the sort of truth building out of our sort of analytical work. We all sort of strive to be very good at patterns identification, making sure that we're documenting things, that we're representing reality, as it were. And I'm personally very interested in again, like getting at those unknowns that we kind of have a difficulty getting at when we just look at the sort of top level data, trying to read between the lines. So just a quick example, flexing a little bit of ACLED output here. This was a report, the first report that ACLED and MilitiaWatch worked on together, which was mid-October, a risk assessment around the US election violence. We identified 5 high risk and 5 moderate risk states and created this big table of risky actors. It was widely reported on. Again, this is 3 weeks before the election and almost 3 months before the storming of the US Capitol building. And here's our table where we broke down the militia, sort of national militia groups, what sort of tendency they came out of, what their size was, what their history of violence and what their potential for violence was in the election period. And I just want to highlight these two here, which were the Oath Keepers and Proud Boys, which did make the chart based on their history of activity in the ACLED data set and what they were saying around the election. And this is not to say that ACLED predicted the storming of the US Capitol, because I don't think anyone can claim that about anything. But it's to say that those of us who were working very closely with the data were sort of sounding the alarm that the sort of contextual situation was very much there for an event like the storming. And just throwing up the Twitter handle and the website for MilitiaWatch if anyone wants to follow us.
Thanks so much, Hampton, and I appreciate the small ACLED shout out. Habib, do you want to round us off with some information on Afghan Peace Watch, and then hopefully we can leave a little bit of time at the end to field any questions from our audience.
Sure. I'll briefly introduce Afghan Peace Watch. So at Afghan Peace Watch, we started this organization earlier February 2020, right after the US Taliban signed a pact, the Peace Pact, and they agreed on reduction in violence. So we launched our initiative of reduction in violence monitoring. That through that initiative, we document and report on real time all war-related violence from all across Afghanistan. And we get the reports, the news from our reporters in the provinces. And on top of that, we have a media monitoring cell here in our Cabo office that we monitor all media outlets, traditional media outlets, radios, and also social media pages that belong to the Taliban and also to the government and other parties. And we also have WhatsApp group with the activists, journalists, and also we have the official spokespeople for the government and also for the Taliban with us on that WhatsApp group that they share the information, and the information that are shared by the news by our reporters, that they can see them too and they can make their comments. And we code our data by location, by province, by source, who had told us that we have different sources from Taliban to government officials to tribal leaders, locals, residents, journalists. And we also code data by perpetrators. So we document all war-related violence in terms of by incidents, and also by who perpetrated the incidents. What we have, one of our biggest challenge that we have in terms of data collection in here is the exaggerated claims from warring parties most of the times, especially in specific types of incidents. For instance, if there are assassinations or if there are IED attacks, they're not much controversy on the figures, but if there is an airstrike, then the government would come up with some figures, and then the Taliban and other local residents, they would offer different figures. And as well as with when we quote incidents by perpetrators, so there is a problem with that. We have a huge number of unclaimed violence, unclaimed incidents in our database that not the Taliban, not Islamic State, and no other party is claiming the responsibility for. We've just started, it's been about a year that we started documenting security incidents, and we've so far documented 4,600, about 4,600 security incident across the country. That is about 24,000 deaths. And those deaths include civilians, the Taliban, and also in this Afghan National Defense and Security Forces. And I have to note that we are since the 4 decades of war in Afghanistan, there is no entity there's no organization that has been focused on the human cost of war. So we, as a nonprofit research and media organization, we are focused on the magnitude of war, what's the human cost of the war. And we document the violence and as well as the war-related incidents and as well as the casualties of all sides, civilians, NDSAP, and also the Taliban. And what we have is then with the data, we have a database for the data that we store the data in. It's called Analytics, and we also report the data through our social media platforms on real time, through Twitter, Facebook, and as well as through our infographic website for monitoring that it's available for public. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Habib. I think that we have just a bit of time left, about 15 minutes or so, to field any questions from the audience. I think Ihara, your technical moderator, will you be able to help us in being able to do that? Ihara? Well, while we wait to hear from Ihara, maybe I can draw some common themes through all of these different discussions that we had. No, thank you so much to all of you for speaking a bit about the challenges. It sounds like while we're all working in really distinct spaces, we have some of the common threads throughout. I mean, a lot of us I know are dealing with things like security challenges, especially to those that are doing information collection within those contexts, whether it's you know, various network like those that Tomás is dealing with, or Iona's team, some of whom she doesn't personally know herself, or you know, Habib, I know you all have representatives from the warring parties on your WhatsApp messages groups, and I think we're all taking, you know, specific steps towards mitigating those types of security concerns. I think, you know, the funding aspect Iona touched on is probably something that we can all of us relate to quite a bit in terms of being able to, you know, you spend all of this time building these infrastructures. And then from there, being able to continue them on. I mean, it's always the worry that we've built something here. What if we have to stop? And then if the funding comes through later, how will we supplement that that gap? Especially given the ephemeral nature of some of the information that we're collecting, which I think was a really great point that Hampton underlined. And then I think, you know, shedding light on the unique context that each of the groups are covering. I mean, I think each has to kind of take into account certain strategies to be able to touch on the specific types of information that they're after, whether it's, you know, casualties in some spaces like the more traditional conventional war zones of Yemen and Afghanistan, whether it's spaces like ongoing kind of more insurgency areas like in Mozambique, or whether it's something that's much more simmering under the surface, it seems like, and increasingly above the surface, like in the US context. Maybe I'll try again and see if our technical mod is here to help us field any questions. Ihara? Okay, well, I guess not. So any of my colleagues, do you all have any further to discuss in terms of, especially after hearing from some of these really interesting presentations about some of the unique things that each of you are dealing with?
Yeah, can I sort of add something? We're trialing at the moment geolocation because it's kind of one of the main things we get asked about, particularly from human rights lawyers, legal teams, anybody that's looking into taking action against parties to the conflict. And we've obviously built our own methodology, but kind of going back to the unknown categories before, it's both time consuming and can have mixed results depending on the categories that you're dealing with. And I was just wondering amongst the rest of the team if anybody else has done geolocation even in a kind of sampling way, and how that's kind of worked for them. I know it's very different environments, but probably maybe much easier in the US context, I'm guessing.
Well, I can speak to it from the ACLED side. I mean, of course, I think you're right that it really varies depending on the different countries we cover. Some places have the problem does not seem to really be a lack of information, but sometimes it's almost too much information to be parsing through. Versus in other spaces, it can be difficult to know the exact locations. At ACLED, I mean, we will code things a general location with geocoordinates, but not. In this day and age, I mean, we get asked a lot if things are all the way specific to like what your mobile phone might pick up, and we don't tend to do that. But I mean, maybe Hampton can speak to some of the things in the US context. I mean, I know even in the US where you would think that things would be quite clear, I know there's still some fuzziness sometimes around some reporting.
Yeah, I mean, so the reporting in the US is always, I guess, an issue. Like, most of the groups that I track do have an explicit media strategy that they are seeking out local journalists to basically run recruitment ads for the group. So they'll kind of take them out to a training day, fire some guns at a target, talk about how they do community service, which largely most of these groups don't. And then the journalists will print that verbatim. And I feel like a lot of times those sort of, because it's talking to a primary source, it's oftentimes privileged in a different way from, getting information more about the activity the groups are doing. But the good thing is that there's plenty of guides out there for people who are trying to report specifically on these types of groups and specifically for local journalists. And if anybody is looking to report on that, feel free to reach out and I can send you like 12 that have some better tips than I can give here in this time frame.
Thanks, Hampton. We seem to finally have a few questions coming in from the audience, so thank you all for your patience while we deal with the technical gap between us. So I think I see a couple for ACLED, which I'd be happy to field, but in an effort to not take up the whole QA period, maybe I'll put this one that's more thematic to the group. The question is, well, first, congrats to everyone for their great work. How can we better gather data to analyze the wider political or developmental context, particularly with regards to violent extremism that might be used as early warnings? And I know some of you all touched on some of these things. I don't know if you have any further reflections in addition to what you've already shared that you would want to share with the audience.
I would want to add something to that question. So it's important to just not look at the statements that extremist groups are putting out. For instance, just giving the example of the Taliban. Looking right now at the Taliban stance, their Qatar office where they are negotiating peace, and also then following and looking what their foot soldiers or what their ordinary supporters say on the ground. So if we follow those statements and that data, if we get that from the ordinary sympathizer or ordinary supporters, not the Taliban leaders, there's a huge difference with the statements and the stance. For instance, the Taliban leader, they would emphasize on making peace deal or reduction in violence. But in fact, the foot soldiers and those on the ground, they will advocate for much more violence. For instance, there was a VBID bombing in Logar province a few weeks back that killed more than 50 people, even though the Taliban officially denied responsibility for that. But looking at other Taliban supporters' pages and groups, they were applauding the attack, and they were kind of advocating for more attacks in urban centers. And also, we can predict what an insurgents group, extremist group would do if we just study the patterns of their attacks in the past and what they're capable of. For instance, in Afghanistan, there is no other group than the Taliban that is capable of carrying out VBIDs. And in the past 1 year, we've recorded more than 90 VBIDs, and among them 35 were unclaimed. So if you look at the pattern of VBID attacks, who have done VBIDs in the past and who are capable, except of the Taliban, there's no other group. So if you get the data, look at the pattern of the data and study it, there we could predict that what could an insurgent or extremist group would be apt to, even though their leadership or their public sense would be something else. Thank you.
Thanks, Habib. I don't know if any of the other panelists have anything to add. I mean, on ACLED's side, I'll be speaking to this more tomorrow for those who want to join at the conference, where I'll be speaking about some of the ways in which we've been harnessing the near real-time nature of ACLED data to look at where we might see potential hotspots, where we're seeing spikes, especially relative to patterns and violence, how volatility and past risk environments are impacting how much one should worry about spikes we're seeing. We have a prediction model that uses machine learning to forecast the actions of specific actors in certain. So there's a multitude of different tools. I think for us, the biggest takeaway is that there's no one silver bullet that will tell you where everything's going to happen. I think there's a lot of both quantitative and qualitative things that need to go into such forecasting, but I'll be speaking to that more tomorrow. Maybe I'll field some of these other questions while we wait on any others to come in. Someone asked, I know there is some literature on this, but would you be willing to comment on the differences between your project and UCDP? My assumption is that that's a question for me at ACLED, given UCDP is a global conflict data program. I think there are a number of differences, which I was trying to touch on earlier in my presentation, the different types of things that feed into different conflict data sets having different outputs. I think we have different mandates. My understanding of UCDP is that they track conflict, violence. We have a broader mandate where we're also looking at strategic developments. We look at protest patterns alongside various political violence. We have different units of analysis. ACLED's really focused on incidents in an event-based format. Again, my understanding of UCDP is that they're more focused on campaigns. Our catchments are a bit different. We have no fatality threshold for inclusion at ACLED. We have a different publication schedule. We publish data weekly at ACLED. And I think, again, the real theme of the panel is that our sourcing really differs. We really prioritize local sources. We prioritize sources in non-English languages, and we benefit from our relationships with partners like those of my panelist colleagues on this session that are doing really great work in really unique contexts. And there's no need to, in our mind, reinvent the wheel when someone else is doing it already so well. And in places where something does not exist, we try to partner with those that are already in those spaces, like the Cabo Ligado example, to build something together. And we really benefit in turn from the information that they're collecting. So, and I say all that without having any formal relationship with UCDP, so apologies if I've misconveyed anything there. and maybe this one feeds into the group a bit more, and I recognize we're almost at the end of time, is that we've, one of the great merits of ACLED has been its consistent methodology over time, allowing confident trend assessment, and how has the engagement with partners, especially new partners, affected that consistency and hence reliability of trend data. In particular, how does this affect the evolution of the attribution of a given event to identify types of event? And I'll just say that when we establish a new partnership, we will first go back and supplement the information with further information they have. So for example, I was mentioning our more recent partnership with Afghan Peace Watch. We are going through and integrating all the information that they have into our data set before we publish that, which is why we haven't launched it yet and are looking forward to doing that in the coming weeks. And that helps us to make sure that we don't introduce artificial spikes into our coverage, while being sure to capture the trends, as reliably as we can. I think whenever we start such partnerships, we try to do that first. We did that more recently in the US context with Hampton and with MilitiaWatch, extending coverage back to the start of ACLED coverage to make sure that those trends are coherent. And then in some contexts, I think partnerships will start as a result of a new threat, like in the Cabo Delgado. So those are more naturally going to not really go back in time. I think with that, we might be at time. So I just wanted to thank all of the panelists for joining me today. I think that was really a great session. And thank you to everyone who's joined us in this conversation. It was really great to be able to engage with all of you. Thank you.